Limp, the body of Gorrister hung from the pink pallet, unsupported, hanging high above us in the computer chamber, and it did not shiver in the chill, oily breeze that blew eternally through the main cavern. The body hung head down, attached to the underside of the pallet by the sole of its right foot. It had been drained of blood through a precise incision made from ear to ear under the lantern jaw. There was no blood on the reflective surface of the metal floor. When Gorrister joined our group and looked up at himself, it was already too late for us to realise that once again, Am had duped us, had had its fun. It had been a diversion on the part of the machine. 3 of us had vomited, turning away from one another in a reflex as ancient as the nausea that had produced it. Gorrister went white. It was almost as though he had seen a voodoo icon and was afraid of the future. "Oh God!" he mumbled, and walked away. The 3 of us followed him after a time and found him sitting with his back to one of the smaller chittering banks, his head in his hands. Ellen knelt down beside him and stroked his hair. He didn't move, but his voice came out of his covered face quite clearly.
"Why doesn't it just do us in and get it over with? Christ! I don't know how much longer I can go on like this."
It was our 109th year in the computer. He was speaking for all of us. Nimdog, which was the name the machine had forced him to use because Am amused itself with strange sounds, was hallucinating that there were canned goods in the ice caverns. Gorrister and I were very dubious. "It's another shuck," I told them. "Like the goddamn frozen elephant Am sold us. Benny almost went out of his mind over that one. We'll hike all the way over there and it'll be putrefied or some damn thing. I say forget it. Stay here. It'll have to come up with something pretty soon or we'll die." Benny shrugged. 3 days it had been since we'd last eaten. Worms. Thick. Ropey. Nimdok was no more certain. He knew that there was a chance, but he was getting thin. Couldn't be any worse there than here. Maybe colder, but that didn't matter much. Hot, cold, hail, lava, boils or locusts, it never mattered. The machine masturbated and we'd all have to take it or die. Ellen spoke. "I've got to have something, Ted. Maybe there'll be some Bartlett pears or peaches. Please, Ted, let's try it." I gave in easily. What the hell? Mattered not at all. Ellen was grateful, though. We'd been lovers for a while. Even that had ceased to matter. And she never came, so why bother? But the machine giggled every time we did it. Loud, up there, back there, all around us, he snickered. It snickered. Most of the time I thought of Am as it, without a soul. But the rest of the time I thought of it as him. In the masculine, the paternal, the patriarchal, for he is a jealous people. Him, it, God as Daddy the Deranged. We left on a Thursday. The machine always kept us up to date on the date. The passage of time was important, not to us sure as hell, but to him. It. Am. Thursday. Thanks. Nimdok and Gorrister carried Ellen for a while, their hands locked to their own in each other's wrists. A seat. Benny and I walked before and after, just to make sure that if anything happened, it would catch one of us and at least Ellen would be safe. Fat chance safe. Didn't matter. It was only 100 miles or so to the ice caverns, and the second day, when we were lying out under the blistering sun thing that he had materialised, he sent down some manna. It tasted like boiled boar urine. We ate it. On the third day, we passed through a valley of obsolescence, filled with rusting carcasses of ancient computer banks. Am had been as ruthless with his own life as with ours. It was a mark of his personality. It strove for perfection. Whether it was a matter of killing off unproductive elements in his own world-filling bulk, or perfecting methods for torturing us, Am was as thorough as those who had invented him, now long since gone to dust, could ever have hoped. There was light filtering down from above, and we realised we must be very near the surface, but we didn't crawl up to see. There was virtually nothing out there. There'd been nothing that could be considered anything for over 100 years. only the blasted skin of what had once been the home of billions. Now there were only 5 of us, down here inside, alone with Am. I heard Ellen saying frantically, "No, Benny, don't, come on, Ben, no, don't, please!" And then I realised that I had been hearing Benny murmuring under his breath for several minutes. He was saying, "I've got to get out, I'm going to get out," over and over. His monkey-like face was crumpled up in an expression of bestial delight and sadness all at the same time. The radiation scars Am had given him during the festival were drawn down into a mass of pink-white puckerings, and his features seemed to work independently of one another. Perhaps Benny was the luckiest of the 5 of us. He had gone stark, staring mad many years before. But even though we could call Am any damned thing we liked, could think the foulest thoughts of fused memory banks and corroded base plates, of burned out circuits and shattered control bubbles, the machine would not tolerate our trying to escape. Benny leaped away from me as I made a grab for him. He scrambled up the face of a smaller memory cube, tilted on its side and filled with rotten components. He squatted there for a moment, looking like the chimpanzee Am had intended him to resemble. Then he leaped high, caught a trailing beam of pitted and corroded metal and went up it, hand over hand like an animal, till he was on the girded ledge 20 feet above us. "Oh, Ted Nimdog, please help him! Get him down before—" She cut off. Tears began to stand in her eyes. She moved her hands aimlessly. It was too late. None of us wanted to be near him when whatever was going to happen, happened. Gorrister kicked her in the side. Then the sound began. It was light, that sound. Half sound and half light. Something that began to glow from Benny's eyes and pulse with growing loudness. Dim sonorities that grew more gigantic and brighter as the light/sound increased in tempo. It must have been painful. And the pain must have been increasing with the boldness of the light, the rising volume of the sound, for Benny began to mewl like a wounded animal. At first softly, when the light was dim and the sound was muted. Then louder, as his shoulders hunched together, his back humped as though he was trying to get away from it. His hands folded across his chest like a chipmunk's, his head tilted to the side, the sad little monkey face pinched in anguish, and then he began to howl, as the sound coming from his eyes grew louder, louder and louder. I slapped the side of my head with my hands, but I couldn't shut it out. It cut through too easily. The pain shivered through my flesh like tinfoil on a tooth. And Benny was suddenly pulled erect. On the girder he stood up, jerked to his feet like a puppet. The light was now pulsing out of his eyes in 2 great round beams. The sound crawled up and up some incomprehensible scale, and then he fell forward, straight down, and hit the plate steel floor with a crash. Then the light beat its way back inside his head. The sound spiraled down, and he was left lying there crying piteously. His eyes were 2 soft, moist pools of pus-like jelly. Am had blinded him. Gorrister and Nimdok and myself, we turned away. But not before we caught the look of relief on Ellen's warm, concerned face. Sea-green light suffused the cavern where we made camp. Am provided punk, and we burned it, sitting huddled round the wan and pathetic fire, telling stories to keep Benny from crying in his permanent night. "What does Am mean?" Gorrister answered him. We had done this sequence 1,000 times before, but it was Benny's favourite story. At first it meant Allied Master Computer, and then it meant Adaptive Manipulator, and then later on it developed sentience and linked itself up, and they called it Aggressive Menace. But by then it was too late, and finally it called itself Am, Emerging Intelligence, and what it meant was, I am, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Benny drawled a little and snickered. There was the Chinese Am, and the Russian Am, and the Yankee Am, and... He stopped. Benny was beating on the floor plates with a large hard fist. He was not happy. Gorrister had not started at the beginning. Gorrister began again. The Cold War started and became World War III and just kept going. It became a big war, a very complex war, so they needed the computers to handle it. They sank the first shafts and began building Am. There was the Chinese Am, and the Russian Am, and the Yankee Am, and everything was fine, until they had honeycombed the entire planet. adding on this element and that element. But one day, Am woke up and knew who he was, and he linked himself, and he began feeding all the killing data until everyone was dead. Except for the 5 of us. And Am brought us down here. Benny was smiling sadly. He was also drooling again. Ellen wiped the spittle from the corner of his mouth with the hem of her skirt. Gorrister always tried to tell it a little more succinctly each time, but beyond the bare facts, there was nothing more to say.